Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Paul and the Faithfulness of God by N.T. Wright, published by Fortress Press in 2013. We're going to move on now and conclude the Greek self-consciousness teaching by Professor Wright. And we're going to get a little bit of a transitional section that takes up Greek and Roman together on religion and culture. So it's going to combine a couple of elements, but we're going to look at pages 236 to 256. And let's begin with the triad on the left. Let's begin with the Wisdom of Solomon from 236 to 246. In block 1, we've got Stoic contributions led to the Greek idea of koinonia, fellowship. Koinonia did emphasize the form of rhetoric. It became very important to master. It was considered the higher art form, but all four schools, the Platonic, the Peripatetic, the Stoic, and the Epicurean, all posited the idea of a common shared community fellowship. The Stoics even labeled it koinonia, just as Paul did. Now let's take a look at block 2, and we're going to see that fellowship and any Greek or Roman idea of fellowship was filtered through a Jewish reading of Stoicism in the apocalyptic document of the Wisdom of Solomon. And Professor Wright wants us to pay attention to this because it plays a significant role as a transitional moment for Paul's early theology. And if you look at block 2, note 1, the Wisdom of Solomon was the mediating apocalyptic text. It took on and posited the concept of Sophia wisdom, which ended up functioning as the replacement term for the Logos and the replacement term for the Pneuma in Stoic philosophy. Sophia wisdom took priority and was posited in the Wisdom of Solomon. So you have a new signification and a new teleosis, or a new teleology, which addressed the new metaphysical workings within the cosmos. It posited the idea that God created the world out of the passive hylae material, and that the self needs the divine wisdom in order to understand these workings of the Spirit within the cosmos. In other words, wisdom is not an automatic human trait. It is imparted by God through grace, according to the Wisdom of Solomon. The divine teleology demands participation in the dikaiosune righteousness, and it did posit all four virtues of temperance, prudence, justice, and courage. Righteousness is tied to the concept of the pre-existent soul and its eternity, and the soul of the righteous man or woman will rest in the hand of God, says the Wisdom of Solomon. The soul of the righteous man or woman will rest in the hand of God. Now, block 3, we'll take a look at how this was an early contribution to Saul, and because the Stoic philosophy was very prevalent in Tarsus, but he would also have been very aware of this Jewish reading of Stoic philosophy. He would have been very familiar with the Wisdom of Solomon. It's not just a simplistic exposition of the Jewish reading of Stoicism. Wisdom is not an automatic human attribute. Wisdom is acquired through righteousness. There's a two-stage eschatology being posited. First, there's the time of resting in the hand of God, and secondly, there's the time of God's return and restoration in doxa glory. So refinement becomes a key term. The Jewish vision of reality is sustained throughout the apocalyptic document. It includes positing an eschatological coming judgment where rulers will be called into account. It did posit a binary system of divinity consisting of Theos and Sophia both. Theos creates, Sophia indwells. And resurrection, of course, was posited. That would have been a scandalon to Athens, as we know from Acts 17. God is both other than the world, but deeply involved in the world. So the Stoic elements are redefined, because logic becomes Israel's narrative scriptures. Physics becomes a rereading of Genesis coupled with Sophia, and ethics is a rereading and repositing of the biblical tradition of dikaiosune righteousness, and Paul certainly took up the concept of dikaiosune righteousness in his theology. So Professor Wright tells us that, first of all, to understand Paul's early theology, we must understand that even though he grew up in Tarsus, where Stoicism was very prevalent, he would have also been very aware of the Jewish reading of Stoicism in the Wisdom of Solomon apocalyptic document. Now from there we want to move on to this next little mini section that Professor Wright brings us into, kind of combining the Greek and the Roman together in the triad on the right. Let's begin by looking at block 1, and you notice that the pagan religion emphasized ritual and precisely worded prayers. There was also an emphasis on piety festivals or sacred calendar. The language of religion was in Latin religio, meaning scruple, but in the New Testament, Professor Wright tells us there was a eusebia piety, threskia worship, and latria service. The actual term of religion was very slow to come into use and to come into being within Christianity. And as far as N.T. Wright is concerned, he says Christianity was not a religion. Paul's early fellowships were more like the philosophical academies. Ancient Stoics and other academies often discussed the theon. Someone could be banished for not taking up the cultic observances. The theon gave the citizens a sense of civic identity and civic security. For the Greeks and the Romans, the world was full of gods, and human life was permeated by the belief that the world was full of gods. In fact, some political officers also took on the role of shrine priest. But with this understanding of the language of religion and the Greek and Roman position on religion, next Professor Wright wants us to look at convergence and differences on this contribution to Paul's early theology. Where are the convergences? Where are the differences? If you look at block 2, we're going to look at note 1. There are overlapping convergences. The concept of anamnesis is the remembrance and the awaiting the presence of Christ, which certainly was a part of Paul's faith communities. Koinonia fellowship was coupled with a sacrificial meal. That, of course, was in Paul's early spiritual fellowships. Daimonia, the distinctive spirits, and the orenos. Paul always mentioned that he was engaged in a spiritual battle with daimonia spirits. He was always in a spiritual battle. He emphasized that a lot. The concept of egeiro, of being raised up after death to the carnal self, was certainly an overlap of ethics between Stoicism and Paul's early theology. And then finally, Professor Wright says, look at the term collegia, or from a kolao, to unite together in a singularity of purpose. That is a very definite convergence also that both Stoicism and Paul's early theology took up. But there are elements of difference. So if you take a look at note 2 here, Paul didn't simply absorb all these concepts. He was very much involved in what? Defining new signification through the experience with a resurrected Christ on Damascus Road. He took all signification, filtered it through the resurrected Jesus Christ, and then rewrote the signs. That's what he did. So there are differences. Number 1, Israel's God is the one true God. Monotheism was posited against plurality. Now Cicero emphasized plurality of observance and service. And so cultus to Cicero meant laboring in observance. So there was some convergence even in this difference with Paul and Cicero. They emphasized care, and they both were teaching refinement of spiritual life. They were both teaching ekpyrosis. So there was an overlap in this concept of ekpyrosis. So observance and refinement lead to higher communal life, which for Paul is the ecclesia. For the Stoics, it's their Stoic philosophical academy fellowships. But for Paul, that's the ecclesia. there is the goal of attaining higher levels of communal life. Now, after looking at the language of religion and the patterns of religion, we need to look at Block 3 and the politics of religion. And a key concept for the Stoics and a key concept for Paul in his early theology is eirene, peace. We are to transition from religious body to political body, where there are both humans and gods involved in moving forward toward kingdom with a horizon of eirene, peace, seeking the peace of the gods. And that means healing, because it means for Greeks and for Romans it means the process of cohesion. Now for Paul, eirene is defined as the healing of fragmentation. We've discussed that many times in previous lessons, but eirene, peace, which Paul always opened his letters and closed his letters with the exhortation of eirene, peace. And that meant, in his early theology, the healing of fragmentation. Now Paul, look at note 3, for Paul, his task in his early theology was to rewrite the signs, to take any signification that was presented to him and to rework it through the filter of the resurrected Jesus Christ and to develop new signs. And so that's very much in alignment with Paul's priority of reaching new signification. He wanted to transition from semeion signs to practical wisdom also. So the Greeks and the Romans posited the idea of a God-soaked culture. They combined peace, healing, and signification to reach practical observance. That included the concept of myth and the concept of story. That aligns perfectly with Paul's emphasis on Israel's narrative and the more precise Pharisee story. So very much would align with Paul. For the Greeks and the Romans, they lived in a myth-infused culture. There were the presence of statues and monuments everywhere that created that visual remembrance of their myth and their story. Corinth had 9 ever-present statues, 3 of Zeus, 2 of Hermes, 1 of Poseidon, and 1 of Apollo, 1 of Aphrodite, and 1 of Athena. So story played a large role in Greek and Roman patterns of religion. For Paul, of course, narrative played a very significant role. The larger, all-enclosing narrative of the narrative of Israel in a covenant relationship with God. That, of course, was in Paul's early theology, coupled with his more precise story of being a Pharisee. So Greek and Roman myth could offer something that Paul could also take hold of in his Jewish narrative position. But the key thing to look at here from Professor Wright is that he's trying to show us that, yes, Paul certainly developed his own early theology. And he spent his early years and during his ministry of really reworking significations, reworking secular significations not only in the Jewish world but in the diaspora world where the Jews had been exiled, and he reworked these signs to develop his early theology. So Professor Wright's telling us, don't ignore the fact that there were contributions made toward Paul, and he would have been aware of them, but of course there are differences. He did remain truly in alignment with the resurrected Christ who he encountered on the Damascus Road. But Professor Wright is telling us that yes, Paul would have been very aware of Stoic philosophy. It was a huge academy in Tarsus. He would have been aware of the Jewish reading of Stoic philosophy in the apocalyptic document of the Wisdom of Solomon. That was already being circulated during his adult years. So the Wisdom of Solomon is a mediating document for Paul. And then Professor Wright tells us also the concepts, the Roman and the Greek concepts, do overlap with Paul because there is a shared overlap in anamnesis, koinonia, daimonia, egeiro, and collegia. They all function as overlapping conceptualizations. But of course, he reminds us, of course there's difference, because Paul was positing the return of the doxa glory in the person of the resurrected, crucified Christ. The resurrected, crucified Jesus of Nazareth. Paul realized the doxa glory has returned to the spiritual temple. So the awaited returning of doxa glory has arrived for Paul. So he's very much about writing his own significations. But Professor Wright is trying to tell us here, and it's a beautiful lesson, but he's reminding us that Paul had contributions from the Jewish reading of Stoicism and from the patterns of religion and culture in the Greek and the Roman world. That's going to wrap up this lesson, but we will have a recall triad that we'll also take up as we have done in the past. So we'll wrap this one up, and then we'll take a look at our recall triad.